I'm really delighted to be joined by Just Stop Oil spokesman Phoebe Plummer. Thank you for coming in, because I know you don't agree with me. How do you square the circle that people want to be more prosperous, they want to lead comfortable lives, but you're saying it's absolutely urgent we stop emissions now? How do you make the two work?
Hi, Jacob. Thank you so much for having me on. As you say, I'm Phoebe. I'm 21 and I'm a student from London and a supporter of Just Stop Oil. And I wonder why you think it's incompatible to help people with the cost of living crisis and to switch to renewables, which are 9 times cheaper than fossil fuels. Can you name me one of your viewers who is suffering the consequences of the cost of living crisis, who doesn't want their energy bills to be 9 times cheaper right now?
Well, unfortunately, that's not what's happening, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and you need to have fossil fuel backup to make up the gap. About half our energy every day is still coming from natural gas. Where's that going to come from?
Well, why aren't we implementing renewable technology? The largest solar farm in the UK was built in 6 weeks.
But it's not
it takes up to 28 years for any oil to come out of the ground in the North Sea.
But it's not going to produce any energy at night. That's the problem with renewables, is that they don't provide the base load that you need.
We already have the capacity to provide so much of our energy from renewables without any technology needed for storage solutions.
But where is this coming from? Because when the wind doesn't blow, when we had really cold days, we were reliant on importing from the EU, on coal and on gas. How are we going to replace that in the short term?
Quite frankly, I'm not a scientist. What I am doing is listening to what all the experts are saying. We're living in this insane world where the experts aren't being listened to. The United Nations has called for no more oil and gas. The International Energy Agency has said we can have no new oil and gas. The IPCC report, the largest global report on the climate crisis, have all said we can have no new oil and gas. How many more experts need to say it?
Because we can't do it tomorrow. What are we going to do in terms of transport? That we still need petrol for cars and we need diesel for lorries. How are we going to get goods into supermarkets without this?
Quite frankly, I'm not a scientist. What I'm doing is I'm looking at the world, and we're living the effects of the climate crisis today. Right now, people are dying. Children are starving. Families are fleeing their homes.
But energy...
And it's preventable. We have the solutions.
Cheap energy is one of the things that has hugely extended life expectancy by the ability to control temperatures, whether this is by air conditioning or by heating, the ability to store food more effectively, the ability to transport food, and indeed use fertilisers to grow more food, has all been essential in increasing life expectancy. Taking all that away would be disastrous for life expectancy.
Do you know what's essential in keeping our food supply? Tackling the climate crisis. This year we lost 1/3 of our wheat crops, half of our potato crops, and it's only going to get worse. We're heading to a future where people are going to be fighting over the last loaves of bread at Lidl.
But the only way we get our wheat crop is by putting the fertilisers on that come from fossil fuels. How are we going to replace that? That the productivity of organic farming is so much lower than of modern farming methods. We cannot feed the world on organic farming, and you must know that.
How do you expect to feed the world when our crops are destroyed by droughts, floods, wildfires, storms?
You've always had weather events that have affected crops, but that actually using fossil fuels for fertilisers and moving on to genetic modification of crops has enormously increased the yield. That since Malthus rate, we've increased agricultural productivity by about 2% per annum. And this is what is allowing people to get extended life expectancy, because they've got more certainty of food. And this all depends on cheap energy, which has come from fossil fuels.
Jacob, you have 6 children? Do you not care about their future? Do you not care about them being able to feed themselves? Because right now, under this government's policies, your 6 children are heading towards a future that is filled with life-threatening extreme weather events, crop failures, famine, war. Suffering on a scale completely unimaginable.
I think you've taken the evidence for an evolving climate and then applied it in an extraordinarily extreme way and are forgetting about the enormous advantages.
I can't believe you're talking to me about an evolving climate.
Well, the climate is...
People are dying.
But this is a statement...
Do you know how many people are suffering around the world?
what evidence is there that this is because we're using fossil fuels, that the climate evolves, but more people die each year from cold than from heat, as you know?
Have you read the IPCC report? What do you mean? What science?
But in terms, you're making extreme claims, but you're suggesting by not using fossil fuels, we would not produce the food we need to feed the world population.
I'm suggesting that if we keep on heading down this genocidal path of mass destruction, then no, there won't be any foods in the supermarket. Then we will see vast swathes of the world uninhabitable. We will see mass displacement of people.
But if you took out fossil fuels tomorrow, you would simply not have the productivity of agriculture you need to feed 8 or 9 billion people. And that would be tomorrow. And I'm not saying you shouldn't reduce emissions. I'm not arguing that. I'm simply saying you must do it when you have the technology to replace the energy that you're using. Because otherwise, all the consequences you're arguing for will happen immediately. We will simply not have the food we need to feed the population of the world.
Jacob, you know we're not asking for the taps to be turned off tomorrow. All of you know that. We're asking for an end to all new fossil fuel licences, in line with what climate scientists around the world are saying.
But if you turn it off for new licences now, you're requiring a change that is going to happen before we have the technology in place to substitute for it. So you may be delaying it by a few years, but this has to be a rational process to do it once you've got the technology sorted out, and we haven't got the technology yet.
So I understand you're an economics man. Yes. So
well, I'm interested in economics.
Yeah. So I've done some maths for you. I hope you don't mind. I looked up your net worth online. It's quite easy to find.
It's not actually true. It's easy to find, but it's not actually true.
In the hundreds of millions.
But that's not.
It costs around £20,000 to insulate a British home. So that's 8,000 British homes for your 150 net million, which is what it says online.
Which is untrue. But
do you really think that you're worth more than 8,000 cold, freezing families?
Have you seen the studies on insulation? That insulation...
Do you care about the people living in fuel poverty?
Very much so. When I was Secretary of State for Energy, I was responsible for developing the plan that has brought energy prices down for families. That was policy that I was intimately involved in designing, so of course I care about that.
So you do understand the report that you're asking me about says that the cost of insulating British homes is so expensive because of the government's failure to insulate British homes.
But what happens 3 years after people have insulated their homes? They use the same amount of energy as they did before. There's been a study on this, which I'm sure you've seen reports on. In the first year, they save money. In the second year, they save a small amount of money. In the third year, they have actually made themselves warmer because the economics of it is they have a certain amount they can spend on energy.
What happens when the government fails to insulate British homes? 7.5 million British people live in fuel poverty. Parents are starving themselves so that they can feed their children, and people are freezing to death in their homes because they are forced to choose between heating and eating. People are dying. Are you hearing me?
Because it's simply not true. The government introduced a cap on energy prices and support for families who couldn't afford energy prices, that those were brought in last year, and they are very significant supports to ensure...
What do you mean it's not true? Have you spoken to an ordinary person who is suffering the cost of living crisis right now?
I don't believe there's any such thing as ordinary people. I believe everybody is in their individual way quite remarkable. I think ordinary people is the most condescending way of referring to our fellow British citizens.
Well, of course you don't relate to the ordinary people. You're a millionaire.
The figures, my personal circumstances, are nothing to do with whether we impoverish people by making energy prices higher. And you want to make them higher, and I don't. But what I'd say to you finally is, why don't you stand for election? Why do you think it is right to throw soup over a picture rather than standing election and seeing if you can get people to vote for your view of the world?
You're an educated man, Jacob. You know that this is how successful movements of social change happen. They must cause disruption. And Antonio Guterres, he's the Secretary-General of the United Nations, he has said that we are on a highway to climate hell. He has said that licensing new fossil fuels is economic and moral madness. The Secretary-General of the United Nations is calling for an end to all new fossil fuels. What makes you think that I have time to get into power and make these changes?
So you want to be a dictator? You don't want voters to decide.
That's absolutely not what I said, and you know that.
Why don't you stand for election? Put yourself forward and see if people want your way.
Because we don't have time. Because
So
if I want to have a future, if I want to have a future where I can feed myself, where I can love my family,
we're not going to feed them.
have...
We're not going to feed them without fossil fuels, which are the essential fertilisers.
We
Thank
need
you
to
for
make
coming
the
on.
change now.
I'm going to have to move on, but I hope you'll come back because I've enjoyed this discussion and I think it's really good of you to have come on. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you to Phoebe. And don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, the Supreme Leader of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, has abdicated. But will her successor, Vienna Better? We'll be debating that shortly.